Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and it's great to see so many people back after what was another fabulous night last night. And could I, on behalf of you all, thank Mercedes-Benz for the gala dinner. I don't know how they manage to outdo themselves each year, but they certainly do. So could you please join me in thanking Mercedes-Benz for last night? And also multi-spares for the Bussy Bar sponsorship. I suspect those who really got the most out of that are probably the ones who aren't back here yet at the moment. Could I also thank Mobitech Australia for sponsoring this session and the disto sign that's sitting at the back here. We've seen the video. It's given us an indication of a range of the sorts of challenges that we're facing in our cities at the moment with respect to infrastructure backlogs, congested roads and so on. And we talked a little bit yesterday about some of the ideas that can be put in place to deal with those problems. We talked about bus rapid transit, for example. One of the major issues that we face at the moment is funding. I put up a slide yesterday that showed the way that had declined over the last 40 years for a 20-year period behind a big backlog that we're facing at the moment. Population growth has been very strong at the same time, so this just adds to the funding problems that we've got. One of the things we're seeing now, and this is a bit of a change, is that a lot of people are starting to see that road pricing is something we need to look at much more seriously as a way to help us deal with these problems. Now, pricing plays a couple of roles. Pricing is very important in helping you make better use of your existing infrastructure. It influences people's behavioural choices so that you can get what we economists talk about as the optimum use of your infrastructure. But it also helps you raise the money to pay for things. And at the moment, we've got some very interesting situations happening. BIC, about 4 years ago, in the second of the major moving people reports, were the first to point out that road users in Australia at the moment are not even covering the costs of building and maintaining road infrastructure. That situation has got worse since we released that report, and you now find organisations like the Productivity Commission, Professor Ian Harper, also talking about the importance of pricing our road use more properly. And we pay for electricity, we pay for water. Why are we so slow in applying the same principles to roads? We pay for public transport, but we don't pay in the same way for roads. Yes, we pay a fuel tax, and yes, we pay a registration charge, but there's really a disconnect in terms of the way we use the resource, the costs that are imposed by those decisions, and the charges that we are levied for our use of that road system. I'm really pleased to say that about 2 weeks ago, I was a part of a small group at Melbourne University who had a couple of hours with the new Minister for Cities and the Built Environment, Jamie Briggs, with the Departmental Secretary, and also Malcolm Thompson, who's head of the Cities Task Force. And what was really pleasing was that road pricing is clearly on Minister Briggs' agenda. I've not heard a minister at federal or state level ever so open to the notion of pricing reform being implemented, ever. I remember when I was Deputy Chairman of the National Road Transport Commission, we suggested to Paul Keating that the brief we had for heavy vehicle charging ought to be extended to light vehicles, and it wasn't probably the most popular suggestion we'd ever given him. I made the same suggestion to John Brumby when he was Victorian Treasurer. I thought he was going to have a heart attack. This stuff is very contentious politically, but we are seeing a rising level of support from a lot of parts of our community in Australia that this is a really important thing to do, both because of a way of dealing with congestion, but also because it's a useful means of raising the sort of revenue that we need to pay for the improvements that we want to put in place. If I can just make a couple of points again to reiterate, as I did yesterday, excuse me, it's too much talking last night. We do have a huge infrastructure backlog, and Peter Brains estimated that at about $150 billion. But we clearly don't make the best use of our existing infrastructure, and congestion is probably the best illustration of that. In terms of trying to go for pricing reform, the principle, it seems to me, ought to be this: we need to make users more accountable for the costs that are occasioned by their travel choices. Now, at the moment in Australia, for heavy vehicle charging, all we look at is infrastructure. That's all we look at. But you also, and I also know, that the other costs of road use include congestion, and we clearly know now that you can't build your way out of congestion, emission costs, air pollution, accident costs, and they're not all met by the insurances we paid. In 2001, BIC was probably the first organisation in Australia to go through and put a price on all those things and look at the amount road users were paying. We found that the costs were about 20 billion more than the revenues. We did it again in 2012, and that gap had blown out to about $30 billion. It's ironic, it seems to me, that we spend all our time in pricing looking at the about $2 billion of costs that heavy vehicles cause and ignore the $40 billion of other community costs that are created by road use. If we want to get serious about reforming road use in Australia, then we wouldn't worry about the heavy vehicle infrastructure damage costs. We would be looking at the congestion costs caused by private vehicles, the accident costs caused by private vehicles. We need to take a much broader approach to this. Now, if we want to go down that path, what are the sorts of things that we need to do to make some progress? And I guess in true Yes Minister terms, this is going to take a courageous decision. If you look at the places around the world that have implemented pricing of this kind, and we're about to hear from the people who are the absolute leaders in this space, Singapore shortly, London, Stockholm, when they implemented their congestion pricing schemes, these had majority of the population against it. So this is real political courage. Ken Livingstone showed at the time in London, and Stockholm put in place in about 2005 or 6 when they implemented their trial. Once these things are in place, they get majority support. Both of those cities have demonstrated that. And in London's case, in the charging area, about a 20% reduction in traffic. If you want to cut congestion, there is only one way, and that is by pricing it. So how might we go in Australia? Well, I think even though I think heavy vehicles are really only the tip of the iceberg, we've already got a heavy vehicle charging scheme. I was part of the introduction of that in 1992. So we need to be looking at trying to refine that pricing scheme so that it moves much more quickly into a mass distance location charging scheme that charges heavy vehicles, and this will mean buses as well, by their weight, by the distance they travel, and when they travel. So if you're in a congested area, you pay more. I think we need, though, if we're going to broaden this to the whole community, and as we've been saying this in BIC for probably the last 5 years, we need a 2-year community conversation about why we need to do it, what's going to be involved, how we're going to do it, and how we're going to look after the people who are going to be adversely affected. If you live in the outer suburbs, where the public transport is, in technical terms, rat shit, then you're going to need some additional public transport services put in place before these schemes are implemented, or they will fail. We can make a few early steps in things like implementing congestion pricing on toll roads. Oregon have just launched a trial for an opt-in distance-based charging scheme as an alternative to a fuel tax. This is something we could do. David Henshaw, my colleague in Sydney, has looked at doing an opt-in distance-based charging scheme as an alternative to a registration charge. But eventually we've got to get to the position of full mass distance location pricing. The Dutch probably got closest to this about 5 years ago. Change of government, it disappeared. So this is really very difficult to do politically. It's going to need a community conversation, but the time is probably better than it's ever been in Australia to try and do something in this regard that is meaningful. Now, we're really very fortunate now to have 2 speakers who can shed light on, in the first case, how Singapore's been able to do this, and over a period now in one form or another of about 40 years, which is really very impressive. And then in terms of Australia's case, the kinds of situation we face in terms of challenges for going forward. Our 2 speakers, and if I can introduce the first speaker, is Leonard Tan. Leonard is a Deputy Director of the Road Pricing Systems, the Land Transport Authority here in Singapore. His current portfolio includes managing the implementation, operations and maintenance of the Singapore electronic road pricing and electronic parking transactions, acquiring services, as well as establishing the design and operation processes for the next generation GNSS-based system, which we heard a little bit about yesterday. Leonard's got an honours degree in electrical and electronic engineering and a Master of Science in Management of Technology. Could you please welcome to the stage Mr. Leonard Tan.